Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to the filth and squalor of medieval times. You're lying in your comfortable bed, clean sheets against your freshly showered skin, scrolling on your phone in a well-heated room. But imagine instead the overwhelming stench of unwashed bodies, the constant itch of lice crawling through your hair, and the grime of weeks without proper bathing caked onto your skin. Let's be honest. You probably wouldn't survive a single day in medieval Europe without running screaming back to your modern bathroom. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In medieval Europe, your approach to personal hygiene would be virtually unrecognizable to your modern sensibilities. The concept of a daily shower? Completely foreign. Most people bathed fully perhaps once or twice a year, usually in the warmer months when exposure wouldn't lead to immediate illness. You wash your face every morning with clean, running water? How luxurious! Instead, you might splash your face and hands with water from a basin that's been used by the entire household, if you're fortunate enough to have access to that much water at all. The wealthy weren't much cleaner, though they did have more options. You might be able to afford occasional visits to public bathhouses if you lived in a larger town or city. These communal bathing places were social hubs where people gathered to soak in wooden tubs of barely warm water that multiple people would use before changing. Historians still argue whether these bathhouses were centers of cleanliness or actually contributed to the spread of disease, as the water wasn't exactly changed between bathers. One person's dirt becoming another's bath water. A charming thought to drift off to sleep with. Your teeth would be in constant agony without modern dentistry. That minty fresh feeling after brushing? Replace it with a mouth full of rotting teeth, receding gums, and breath that could knock out a horse. If you were particularly health conscious, you might rub your teeth with a rough cloth and some abrasive powder made from crushed herbs, salt, or even crushed seashells. Imagine sanding down your enamel every morning instead of using that gentle bristled toothbrush. Tooth decay was so common that having a full set of teeth by your 30s would mark you as either extraordinarily lucky or suspiciously wealthy. Deodorant? Absolutely not. The closest thing to covering body odor would be applying perfumed oils if you were among the elite, or carrying sweet-smelling herbs if you were more common. Most people simply lived with what we would consider an overpowering stench. Your nose would eventually adjust, a phenomenon scientists call olfactory fatigue, allowing you to stop noticing the constant barrage of body odors, animal waste, and rotting garbage that permeated medieval towns. One particularly quirky hygiene practice was the use of urine as a cleaning agent. Yes, human urine. The ammonia content made it effective for removing stains from clothing and even as a mouth rinse. Next time you're swishing with your alcohol-based mouthwash, be grateful you weren't born in the 13th century, where you might be gargling with something far more pungent. Hair care would be another struggle. Without shampoo, your hair would be cleaned rarely, if ever. The accumulation of natural oils would make it appear perpetually greasy. To combat the inevitable head lice, which were so common they were simply considered a fact of life, you might shave your head completely if you were a peasant man, or keep it tightly covered if you were a woman. The aristocracy fared slightly better, using fine-toothed combs to remove lice and their eggs, though even queens weren't immune to these persistent parasites. Women's menstrual hygiene consisted primarily of rags that were washed and reused, if they were washed at all. No disposable products, no pain relievers, just uncomfortable cloths and a society that often viewed menstruation with superstition and discomfort. Many believed that a menstruating woman could spoil food, kill plants, or even drive dogs mad just by her presence. As you trudge through the muddy streets of your medieval town, your stomach growls in protest. The hunger pangs remind you that it's time for another risky encounter with what passes for food in this era. Modern food safety regulations? Non-existent. FDA inspections? A concept so far in the future it might as well be magic. Your daily meals are an adventure in survival rather than a pleasure to be enjoyed. The first thing you'd notice about medieval food is the overwhelming emphasis on preservation. Fresh meat is a luxury most can't afford, so you're typically eating something that's been salted, smoked, or pickled to within an inch of recognizability. That bacon you love for Sunday brunch? In medieval times, it would be so heavily salted it would scrape the roof of your mouth raw, and you'd still be grateful for it. Most people preserve their meat by hanging it in chimneys where smoke would help prevent decay. The resulting flavor was intensely smoky, often masking the taste of meat that had begun to turn anyway. When fresh meat is available, it's not exactly following USDA guidelines. Animals are slaughtered in open areas, their blood and entrails often flowing directly into the same streets you walk on. The concept of bacterial contamination is centuries away from being understood, so the butcher handles raw meat with the same unwashed hands he uses to take your coins. That medium-rare steak you enjoy at your favorite restaurant? Here, undercooked meat is a one-way ticket to intestinal parasites that would make modern food poisoning seem like a gentle reminder to eat better. Vegetables aren't the safe alternative you might hope for either. Modern vegetables are the product of centuries of careful breeding for taste, yield, and disease resistance. Medieval vegetables are smaller, tougher, more bitter versions that you'd barely recognize. Carrots aren't orange but purple or white. Apples are sour enough to make your face pucker. And everything is seasonal. There's no popping to the grocery store in December for strawberries shipped from another hemisphere. Your bread, a dietary staple, comes with its own set of hazards. The grain used to make flour is often stored in damp conditions where it develops ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. Historians still argue whether some cases of alleged witchcraft might actually have been ergot poisoning, with entire communities experiencing psychedelic episodes from their daily bread. Even when the grain is clean, the grinding process introduces stone dust and other impurities. Your teeth wear down prematurely from chewing bread that contains tiny particles of stone from the millstones used to grind the flour. If you're a peasant, your typical meal consists of a vegetable pottage, essentially a perpetual stew kept simmering over the hearth, with new ingredients added as available and old ones fished out when hunger demands. This pot might not be emptied or properly cleaned for months. The stew on Monday contains Sunday's leftovers, which contains Saturday's additions, and so on back through time in a culinary genealogy that would horrify any modern health inspector. Spices are rare and expensive, used more as status symbols than flavor enhancers. If you're wealthy, you might showcase your fortune by heavily spicing your food, not to mask the taste of spoilage, as is commonly believed, but simply to demonstrate that you can afford such luxuries. The poor make do with local herbs, garlic, and onions for flavoring. That carefully balanced spice cabinet in your modern kitchen? It represents more wealth than most medieval peasants would see in a lifetime. Drinking water is another daily gamble. The connection between contaminated water and disease isn't understood, so water sources are often polluted with human waste and other hazards. Instead, most people drink weak ale or wine throughout the day, even children. The alcohol content is low, but the fermentation process kills many of the pathogens that would otherwise make you sick. Your morning coffee or tea is replaced with a mug of room temperature ale that tastes nothing like the craft beers you might enjoy on weekends. One particularly quirky aspect of medieval dining is the belief in the humoral theory of food. Every food item is classified as hot or cold, wet or dry, and believed to affect the body's internal balance of these qualities. Eating the wrong combination could supposedly cause illness or even character flaws. Melons, for instance, are considered cold and wet and should never be eaten with wine, which is hot and dry. This medieval food science means every meal is a complex calculation of balancing influences, an early form of nutritional neurosis that makes modern diet fads seem straightforward. For the wealthy, dining is an elaborate performance. Food is served in removes or courses, sometimes as many as 20 for a grand feast. Exotic dishes like roasted peacock were dressed in its own feathers, or live birds released from a pie create spectacle rather than sustenance. The concept of eating for nutrition is barely considered. Food is about power, status, and excess for those who can afford it. Meanwhile, the poor subsist on gruel so thin you could read through it, if anyone had taught you to read. As the day's labor finally ends and darkness creeps across the village, you face yet another medieval challenge: getting a decent night's sleep. That memory foam mattress, Egyptian cotton sheets, and climate-controlled bedroom you take for granted? Replace all of that with a scratchy pile of straw that's been housing generations of fleas, lice, and possibly a family of mice. For the average peasant, your bed is little more than a sack stuffed with whatever filling material is locally available. Usually straw, but sometimes dried leaves, moss, or even rushes pulled from the nearest wetland. This makeshift mattress sits directly on the packed earth floor or, if you're slightly more prosperous, on a simple wooden platform. The concept of box springs or mattress support is still centuries away. Every night, you feel each individual piece of straw poking through the rough cloth sack, creating a constellation of uncomfortable pressure points across your exhausted body. Privacy while sleeping? Absolutely not. Your entire family, parents, children, grandparents, possibly even servants, all share a single room. The wealthy might have bed curtains for a modicum of separation, but for most people, sleeping is a communal activity whether you like it or not. That means every cough, snore, and bodily function happens in close proximity to everyone else. Your modern habit of scrolling through social media before bed is replaced with listening to your father's thunderous snoring and your little brother's midnight coughing fits. The medieval sleeping position would also seem strange to your modern sensibilities. Most people didn't lie flat on their backs with a pillow under their heads. Instead, the common sleeping position was semi-reclined, almost sitting up, which was thought to aid digestion and prevent bad humors from rising to the head during sleep. Historians still argue whether this was truly a health precaution or simply a practical adaptation to inadequate bedding that couldn't comfortably support a fully prone position. Your pillow, if you're fortunate enough to have one, isn't the soft, hypoallergenic marvel you're used to. It's more likely a hard bolster filled with more straw or perhaps wool if you're wealthier. Some medieval medical texts actually warned against using pillows that were too soft, claiming they would cause deformities of the head and neck or allow unhealthy vapors to accumulate around the sleeper. Blankets are similarly rough and utilitarian. Forget about your plush duvet, you're covered with coarse woolen blankets that itch incessantly. In poorer households, people simply sleep in their day clothes, perhaps adding a cloak or extra layer in colder months. Only the very wealthy enjoy anything resembling proper bedding, with linen sheets and finer wool or even fur coverlets. Temperature control is entirely at the mercy of the seasons. In winter, the only heat source is likely the central hearth, which dies down overnight, leaving the furthest corners of the room freezing cold. In summer, open windows invite in cooling breezes along with mosquitoes and flies. There's a reason medieval sleepwear often included nightcaps. They kept your head warm in the winter cold and provided at least some protection from biting insects in warmer months. One particularly quirky aspect of medieval sleeping arrangements is the practice of first sleep and second sleep. Rather than our modern expectation of a single, uninterrupted 8 hours, medieval people typically slept in two distinct phases. You'd go to bed shortly after sundown for your first sleep of 3 to 4 hours, then wake for 1 to 2 hours in the middle of the night, a time used for prayer, quiet contemplation, intimate relations, or even visiting neighbors. Then you'd return to bed for your second sleep until dawn. This biphasic sleep pattern was so normal that medical texts included remedies for people who couldn't fall back asleep for their second phase. The nighttime soundscape would be utterly foreign to your modern ears. Instead of distant traffic or the hum of air conditioning, you'd hear the shuffling of animals. Yes, in many peasant homes, livestock might share your sleeping space, especially in winter when their body heat was a valuable resource. Chickens roosting in the rafters might periodically drop unpleasant surprises. Rats and mice scurry through the thatch overhead, occasionally dislodging debris onto your face. For most of history, bedbugs were such common bedfellows that they weren't even considered a particular problem, just another fact of life. The persistent itching from their bites would be a constant companion, along with the welts they leave behind. Your modern panic at finding a single bedbug in a hotel would seem ludicrous to medieval people, who simply accepted them as inevitable nighttime companions. Even your sleep schedule differs dramatically from modern norms. With no artificial lighting beyond expensive candles or smoky rush lights soaked in animal fat, your body naturally syncs with the sun. This means longer sleep in winter, shorter in summer, and always a rush to complete necessary tasks before darkness falls. The phrase early to bed, early to rise isn't just good advice. It's a non-negotiable reality of pre-industrial life. As the morning light filters through the cracks in your shabby dwelling, you rise from your vermin-infested sleep pallet and face another day of medieval life. Now comes the humbling task of getting dressed, an exercise in discomfort that would make your modern sensibilities revolt. Forget about that soft cotton t-shirt and stretchy jeans. Your medieval wardrobe is an assault on your skin and sensory system. For the average peasant, your clothing starts with a basic undergarment called a chemise or shift, essentially a long, shapeless shirt made of linen if you're lucky, but more likely hemp or rough wool if you're among the poorer classes. This serves as your underwear, nightshirt, and sweat-absorbing layer. And speaking of sweat, remember those bathing habits we discussed earlier? This garment might be the only piece of clothing you wash with any regularity, and even then, regularly could mean once a month or less. The fabric against your skin feels nothing like the soft, processed materials you're accustomed to. Medieval will come straight from local sheep, coarse and full of lanolin, that waxy, waterproofing substance that sheep naturally produce. While lanolin has some benefits in keeping you dry during rainy weather, it also creates an itchy, scratchy sensation that never quite goes away. Every movement brings a fresh reminder that your clothing is essentially wearing you as much as you're wearing it. Over your basic undergarment, you don a tunic or kirtle depending on your gender. These outer garments are typically made of wool so rough it would qualify as exfoliation in modern spas. The dyes used to color these fabrics, if you can afford colored clothing at all, come from plants, minerals, and sometimes even insects. These natural dyes fade quickly, smell peculiar, and occasionally cause skin reactions. That vibrant blue tunic might look impressive for the first few weeks, but it's tinting your skin and causing a rash that modern dermatologists would find fascinating. Fastenings are another adventure in patience and discomfort. Zippers? Not invented yet. Elastic waistbands? Pure fantasy. Instead, your clothing is held together with crude wooden toggles, leather laces, or if you're relatively wealthy, metal pins. For the truly prosperous, small buttons made of wood, bone, or precious metals serve as both functional fasteners and status symbols. Getting dressed or undressed is a time-consuming process requiring dexterity and often assistance from others. One particularly quirky aspect of medieval fashion is the use of lacing to create form-fitting garments. Without the benefit of modern stretchy fabrics, the only way to achieve a close fit is to essentially sew yourself into your clothes each morning. Women's bodies and kirtle often feature side or back lacing that needs to be pulled tight and tied off. The resulting pressure points and restricted movement make modern shapewear seem positively liberating by comparison. Footwear presents its own special torment. Your shoes are likely made of a single piece of leather, roughly cut to shape and stitched together. There's no concept of left and right shoes. You simply wear them until they begin to conform to your feet, then continue wearing them until they literally fall apart. With no rubber soles or cushioning, every step on cobblestone streets or uneven paths sends jarring impacts straight through your body. Historians still argue whether medieval people suffered more from foot ailments or simply became accustomed to a level of foot pain that modern humans would find unbearable. For peasants working in the fields, shoes might be a luxury saved for winter or church attendance. During warmer months, you might go barefoot, exposing yourself to parasites like hookworm that enter through the soles of your feet. If you're slightly better off, you might wear wooden pattens, overshoes designed to lift your leather footwear above the mud and filth of medieval streets. Walking in these is like wearing primitive platform shoes, unstable and noisy on any hard surface. Headwear isn't optional in medieval times. It's practically mandatory for both practical reasons and social conventions. Men wear coifs, close-fitting caps, or hats appropriate to their station. Women keep their hair covered with veils, wimples, or headdresses depending on their status and the current fashion. These head coverings serve multiple purposes. They signify your social standing, keep your unwashed hair somewhat contained, and provide a barrier against the ever-present lice that would otherwise have direct access to your scalp. The concept of seasonal wardrobes exists, but with far fewer options than you're used to. In winter, you simply layer more of the same uncomfortable garments, perhaps adding a cloak made of, you guessed it, more scratchy wool. This outer layer might be treated with additional waterproofing substances like more lanolin or even wax, making it stiff and heavy as well as itchy. There's no such thing as lightweight, breathable rainwear. You either get wet or carry what feels like a small carpet draped over your shoulders. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of medieval clothing for modern sensibilities would be its longevity in your wardrobe. Your medieval self might own just 2 or 3 outfits total, wearing them until they're literally falling apart, then patching and repairing them until they're more patched than original garment. That Marie Kondo-inspired closet clean-out where you donate perfectly good clothes that no longer bring joy would be incomprehensible to your medieval counterpart, who recognizes each garment as representing weeks or months of labor to produce. The sneezing starts around mid-morning. By afternoon, you're feeling feverish, and a persistent pain has developed in your lower abdomen. In your modern life, this might warrant a trip to urgent care or at least some over-the-counter medication. In medieval times, you're about to embark on a medical adventure that would terrify any contemporary health professional and might very well send you to an early grave. Medieval medicine operates on principles so foreign to modern understanding that they seem more like elaborate superstition than healthcare. The foundation of all medical theory is the concept of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which must remain in perfect balance for good health. Any illness is attributed to an imbalance that must be corrected, usually through methods that range from the uncomfortable to the downright dangerous. That headache you're developing? A medieval physician might diagnose it as an excess of blood, the solution being to cut open a vein and drain a significant quantity of your precious bodily fluid into a bowl. This procedure, known as bloodletting, is performed with frighteningly little precision. The barber surgeon, yes, the same person who cuts your hair might be the one cutting open your veins, uses crude metal or bone implements that haven't been sterilized because germ theory won't be developed for centuries. One particularly quirky medical treatment involves the application of live animals to draw out illness. Have a persistent cough? A common recommendation is to hold a live frog against your throat, as the creature is believed to absorb the disease. Other ailments might call for leeches, which at least have some medical logic behind them as they prevent blood clotting at wound sites, though medieval practitioners weren't using them for this reason but rather to suck out bad humors. Medicines themselves bear little resemblance to the carefully controlled pharmaceuticals you're accustomed to. Herbal remedies formed the backbone of treatment, and while some did contain effective compounds, willow bark, for instance, contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin. The preparation and dosage were wildly inconsistent. Your medicine might be prepared by a monastery apothecary, a village wise woman, or a traveling charlatan, each with their own recipes and beliefs about proper treatment. The theory of sympathetic magic heavily influences medieval pharmacology, meaning that treatments often involve ingredients that resemble the affected body part or symptom. Suffering from jaundice with its characteristic yellow skin? You might be prescribed a concoction containing yellow ingredients like saffron or marigold petals. This doctrine of signatures assumes God has marked healing plants with signs indicating their medicinal purpose. Walnuts for brain ailments because they resemble a miniature brain, for example. Surgery, when deemed necessary, is a traumatic experience performed without anesthesia beyond perhaps alcohol or opium if you're fortunate. A skilled surgeon prides himself on speed rather than precision, knowing that the longer you're under the knife, the less likely you are to survive. Amputation might take under a minute, with assistants physically restraining you during the procedure. Infections are rampant, with post-surgical mortality reaching horrifying levels by modern standards. Trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure or release evil spirits, is performed on conscious patients who are held down during the excruciating process. Remarkably, archaeological evidence shows that many recipients of this procedure actually survived, as indicated by skull bones that show signs of healing around the drill sites. Historians still argue whether this survival rate indicates some genuine medical benefit to the procedure in treating certain conditions like subdural hematomas, or whether it simply reflects the remarkable resilience of the human body despite barbaric medical practices. For women, childbirth presents particularly dangerous medical challenges. Modern obstetrical care has reduced maternal mortality to about 0.02% in developed countries. In medieval Europe, your chances of dying in childbirth might be 1 to 2% per birth. With the average woman experiencing multiple pregnancies throughout her fertile years, the cumulative risk becomes frighteningly high. Midwives assist with delivery, using a combination of practical experience and traditional methods that sometimes work wonderfully but offer little recourse when serious complications arise. Dental care consists primarily of extraction when the pain becomes unbearable. There's no drilling and filling, no root canals, certainly no cosmetic dentistry. If a tooth is causing problems, it's coming out, often without effective pain management beyond perhaps cloves or strong alcohol. Dental tools resemble torture implements more than medical devices, and the procedure is performed by barber surgeons or specialized tooth drawers rather than trained dentists. Mental illness receives particularly troubling treatment in medieval times. Conditions we now understand as depression, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder might be attributed to demonic possession, sin, or moral failings. Treatment could involve exorcism, pilgrimage to holy sites, or confinement in conditions that would only exacerbate the condition. In some cases, the mentally ill are actually treated with compassion in specialized hospitals, but the understanding of the underlying conditions remains firmly rooted in supernatural rather than medical explanations. Perhaps most alarming to modern sensibilities is the lack of any concept of germs, bacteria, or contagion. A physician might examine the feces or urine of a dozen different patients, move directly from one to the next without washing hands, and even taste or smell bodily fluids as part of diagnosis. This practice alone would spread disease at an alarming rate, creating iatrogenic illnesses, those caused by the healer rather than pre-existing conditions. That doctor's visit you schedule when you're feeling under the weather? In medieval times, it might actually be the thing that kills you. After your terrifying encounter with medieval healthcare, you find yourself facing another pressing bodily need, one that modern infrastructure has made almost thoughtless in your daily routine. That clean, private bathroom with running water and scented toilet paper? Replace all of that with a bewildering array of unsanitary, public, and often downright disgusting options for relieving yourself in medieval times. For the average peasant, the concept of a dedicated bathroom doesn't exist. Your home likely doesn't have any specialized space for personal elimination. When nature calls in the middle of the night, you likely use a chamber pot, essentially just a large ceramic vessel kept under the bed or in a corner. Come morning, the contents are typically dumped out the nearest window or door, often with a perfunctory shout of "Garde à l'eau," from the French garde à l'eau, watch out for the water, as your only warning to passers-by below. This practice is so common that some medieval towns have ordinances requiring residents to shout before emptying chamber pots, though compliance is spotty at best. If you live in a rural setting, you might simply step outside to a designated area behind your dwelling or into the nearest stand of trees. Toilet paper? Pure fantasy. Instead, you use whatever natural materials are at hand, moss, leaves, or smooth stones. The wealthy might use wool or hemp cloth that can be washed and reused, while those at court could enjoy the luxury of actual lamb's wool for this purpose. Most people, however, simply make do with whatever is available, including their own hand, strictly the left, as the right hand is reserved for eating, a distinction with obvious hygienic implications. In castles and larger manor houses, you might encounter the garderobe, a small room projecting from an upper floor with a stone or wooden seat featuring a hole that opens directly to the outside. These medieval toilets discharge waste directly down the exterior wall, often into a moat or ditch surrounding the structure. The name garderobe, literally guardrobe, comes from the practice of hanging clothing in these spaces, as the ammonia from urine was believed to repel moths and other pests. That's right. The medieval equivalent of a closet and toilet is the same room, with your finest clothes hanging above an open cesspit. One particularly quirky toilet arrangement can be found in some monasteries, where communal latrines feature long stone benches with holes cut at regular intervals, allowing multiple monks to relieve themselves simultaneously while continuing their discussions or even religious readings. These facilities often feature running water channels beneath to carry waste away. An impressive feat of engineering for the time, but still far from private or particularly sanitary by modern standards. Public latrines exist in most towns and cities, typically positioned over streams or rivers to allow flowing water to carry waste away. Using these facilities is a distinctly social experience. Privacy is not a consideration, and conversations continue uninterrupted during elimination. Some medieval public toilets even feature 2 or more stories, with holes in the upper floors positioned directly above those on the lower levels. The social etiquette of using these multi-story arrangements without inconveniencing those below you is a skill modern humans haven't had to develop. For those who can't make it to a proper facility, the streets themselves often serve as toilets, particularly in urban areas. The concept of public urination being inappropriate is largely absent. It's a normal sight to see people relieving themselves against walls or into gutters. This contributes significantly to the overwhelming stench of medieval towns, already plagued by animal waste, rotting garbage, and the general absence of effective sanitation systems. The disposal of human waste presents enormous public health challenges that won't be properly addressed for centuries. In cities, cesspits collect waste from multiple households and require periodic emptying by gong farmers, specialized workers who remove the accumulated filth at night and cart it outside city walls. This hazardous profession is so unpleasant that gong farmers are often permitted to work naked, to avoid ruining clothes, and are paid significantly more than average laborers. Some are even exempt from certain taxes or granted special privileges in exchange for performing this essential but repulsive task. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely unaware of the connection between waste management and disease or simply lacked the infrastructure to address the problem effectively. Some medieval municipalities did enact ordinances against dumping waste in certain areas or require homeowners to clean the street in front of their property, suggesting at least a rudimentary understanding that filth and illness might be related. However, without germ theory, these measures were inconsistent and often ineffective. The lack of effective sewage systems has direct consequences for water quality. Wells and streams in urban areas are frequently contaminated by nearby cesspits or simple runoff from streets where waste accumulates. This contamination creates a deadly cycle. Waterborne diseases spread through tainted water sources, causing diarrheal illnesses that create more waste, which further contaminates water supplies. Your modern expectation of safe drinking water from any tap is utterly foreign to medieval reality. For women, managing menstruation adds another layer of complexity to already challenging toilet arrangements. Absorbent materials like moss, linen rags, or wool are used to collect menstrual blood and must be washed or replaced as needed. A difficult task when privacy is minimal and water requires significant effort to obtain. Many women in agricultural settings simply allow the blood to flow into their multiple layers of clothing, which are dark-colored specifically to hide such stains. Perhaps the most disorienting aspect of medieval toilet habits for modern sensibilities would be the near-complete lack of hand washing. The connection between hand hygiene and disease prevention won't be established for centuries, meaning that people routinely handle food, touch communal objects, and greet each other after toilet use without cleaning their hands. This single difference in behavior would dramatically increase your risk of contracting numerous illnesses and infections compared to your modern life. Dawn breaks over the medieval landscape, and as the roosters crow, you're already expected to be up and productive. That 9 to 5 job with paid vacation, sick leave, and regular breaks? Replace all of that with a punishing work schedule that would violate every modern labor law and leave your body broken before you reach what we now consider middle age. For the average peasant, your workday is dictated not by the clock, mechanical timepieces being rare and expensive, but by the sun. You rise at first light, often before dawn in summer months, and continue working until dusk makes your tasks impossible. This could mean 16-hour workdays during summer harvest seasons, with only the briefest pauses for meager meals. The concept of weekends doesn't exist. While Sunday is theoretically reserved for church and rest, the realities of animal care and time-sensitive agricultural tasks mean that work continues in some form 7 days a week. Seasonal variations create extreme fluctuations in your work schedule. Winter might offer slightly shorter workdays due to limited daylight, but it brings its own challenges. The bitter cold makes every task more difficult as you struggle to maintain dexterity in numbing temperatures. Without modern insulation or effective heating, your body never truly warms up during winter workdays, creating a constant drain on your energy reserves as you shiver through essential tasks. The physical intensity of medieval labor would shock your modern body, accustomed as it is to ergonomic chairs and repetitive strain injury awareness. Plowing fields means walking miles behind a temperamental ox or horse, physically wrestling with a heavy wooden plow to keep it cutting straight furrows through soil that might be rocky, root-filled, or clay-heavy. Harvesting grain requires swinging a scythe or sickle for hours on end, the repetitive motion creating blisters that eventually callus into permanent deformities on your hands. One particularly quirky aspect of medieval work life is the concept of sleep shifting during intensive agricultural periods. During harvest time, workers might adopt a polyphasic sleep pattern, working from dawn until mid-morning, taking a 2-hour sleep break during the hottest part of the day, then continuing work until darkness, sleeping again for a few hours, and rising for a midnight to early morning shift of grain processing. Historians still argue whether this extreme schedule was widespread or limited to certain regions, but archaeological evidence of nighttime work activity during harvest seasons suggests the practice wasn't uncommon. Occupational hazards abound with virtually no safety regulations or protective equipment. Blacksmiths regularly suffer burns and eye injuries from flying sparks and metal fragments. Stonemasons develop silicosis from inhaling stone dust over decades of work. Tanners handling animal hides preserved with urine and toxic chemicals experience shortened lifespans due to constant exposure to harmful substances. Modern OSHA regulations would shut down virtually every medieval workplace within minutes of inspection. Child labor isn't just permitted, it's expected. Children as young as 6 or 7 begin contributing to household work, initially with simple tasks like gathering kindling or scaring birds from fields, but progressively taking on more demanding responsibilities. By 12 or 13, children are generally considered capable of adult work, particularly in agricultural settings. The modern concept of childhood as a protected period of development and education is almost entirely absent from medieval thinking. For those pursuing skilled trades through the guild system, the path begins with apprenticeship, often starting around age 7 to 14. As an apprentice, you're essentially indentured to a master craftsman, living in their household and working for room, board, and training rather than wages. The working conditions are entirely at the master's discretion, with physical discipline commonly used to correct mistakes. Your apprenticeship might last 7 to 10 years before you advance to journeyman status and can finally earn actual wages for your labor. Women's work, while different from men's in many respects, is no less demanding. In addition to assisting with agricultural labor during crucial seasons, women are responsible for maintaining the household, preparing food from raw ingredients, a tremendously time-consuming process without modern conveniences. Spinning thread, weaving cloth, making and mending clothing, and caring for children. The day begins before anyone else rises and often extends after the household is asleep. The saying, "A man works from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done," reflects the reality of medieval gender divisions in labor. Payment for your endless labor rarely comes in the form of currency as we understand it today. If you're a peasant working land owned by a lord, your compensation is primarily the right to keep a portion of what you produce while rendering the rest as rent. This feudal arrangement means years of abundant harvests barely improve your standard of living, while poor harvests bring immediate threat of starvation. There's no such thing as saving for retirement. You simply work until you physically cannot, then hope your children will support you. Perhaps most disorienting to modern sensibilities would be the complete absence of retirement as a concept. The expectation is that you work until death or debilitating injury/illness makes it impossible to continue. As physical capabilities decline with age, you shift to less demanding tasks rather than stopping work entirely. Elderly peasants might focus on mending tools, watching young children, or processing food, while those with more physical strength handle heavier labor. The modern expectation of decades of leisure after a working life would seem like an impossible fantasy. The psychological burden of such relentless labor without the prospect of improvement or advancement creates a fundamentally different relationship with work than modern people experience. There's little expectation that work should be fulfilling or emotionally rewarding. It's simply what must be done to survive another season. This perspective might actually offer some psychological protection, as disappointment requires expectation, but it would feel deeply alien to your contemporary mindset that includes career advancement, personal growth, and work-life balance as basic expectations. Your aching muscles finally get a brief respite as you pause in your work, But your moment of rest is interrupted when you witness a fellow villager being dragged away by the Lord's men. Apparently, he failed to remove his hat in the presence of a nobleman, a seemingly minor oversight that's about to result in very public consequences. The justice system of medieval times bears almost no resemblance to the due process and reasonable punishments you take for granted in the modern world. Medieval justice operates on principles that would horrify contemporary legal experts. The concept of innocent until proven guilty is centuries away from being established. Instead, accusation often presumes guilt, with the burden on the accused to somehow prove their innocence. Evidence as we understand it plays a minimal role in many proceedings, replaced by reputation, social standing, and sometimes purely supernatural methods of determining guilt or innocence. For minor offenses like public drunkenness, minor theft, or violations of social etiquette, punishment tends toward public humiliation rather than incarceration. The stocks and pillory, wooden frameworks that restrain offenders in uncomfortable positions in the town square, serve as both punishment and deterrent. Locked into these devices for hours or days, you're exposed to the elements and the mercies or lack thereof of your community. Passers-by might pelt you with rotten food, mud, or worse. The psychological damage of such public shame in small, tight-knit communities where reputation is crucial can be more lasting than the physical discomfort. One particularly quirky method of medieval justice is the trial by ordeal, used when evidence is lacking or inconclusive. These procedures operate on the belief that God will intervene to protect the innocent, making them fundamentally religious rather than legal tests. In the ordeal of hot water, you plunge your arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone. If your burns heal cleanly within 3 days, you're innocent. In the ordeal of fire, you carry a red-hot iron bar for several paces. Again, clean healing indicates divine protection and thus innocence. Historians still argue whether clergy sometimes manipulated these ordeals to achieve desired outcomes, perhaps by controlling the water temperature or iron heat based on their assessment of the accused character. For those of higher social standing, the trial by combat offers an alternative that at least gives you some agency in your fate. You or your champion physically fight your accuser or their representative, with the victor presumed to have God's favor and thus justice on their side. This system obviously favors the physically strong and those wealthy enough to hire skilled champions, making it less about actual guilt and more about resources and combat prowess. The medieval court system itself would be almost unrecognizable to your modern understanding. Different courts handle different types of cases. Ecclesiastical courts for religious matters and some civil issues like marriage, manorial courts for disputes within a lord's domain, royal courts for more serious criminal matters. Navigating this complex system without formal legal training or representation, as concepts like public defenders don't exist, would be nearly impossible for the average person. Punishments for serious crimes are designed not just to punish the offender, but to serve as spectacular warnings to the community. Public executions are community events, sometimes drawing crowds from surrounding villages. The method of execution often reflects the crime: hanging for theft and murder, burning for heresy or witchcraft, beheading, a quicker death considered more merciful, for nobles or political offenses. These executions are elaborate performances with religious and political dimensions, sometimes lasting hours as the condemned is expected to confess publicly and offer a good death that acknowledges the justice of their punishment. For crimes deemed severe but not warranting death, mutilation serves as both punishment and permanent marker of criminality. Thieves might lose a hand, perjurers could have their tongues removed, and sexual offenders might be castrated. These punishments permanently mark the offender, making rehabilitation and reintegration into society virtually impossible. Another stark contrast to modern justice systems that at least nominally aim for rehabilitation. The concept of prison as punishment is largely absent from medieval justice. While dungeons and cells exist, they're primarily for holding the accused until trial or execution rather than as punishments themselves. Long-term incarceration is rare, partly because maintaining prisoners is expensive for the state or lord. This creates a justice system focused almost entirely on corporal punishment, execution, or fines rather than imprisonment. Speaking of fines, medieval justice operates on a principle that would seem corrupt by modern standards. Nearly any crime can be commuted to a fine if you have sufficient wealth. This system, known as wergild in some contexts, literally puts a price on criminal acts. Kill a peasant? That's X amount in compensation to their family. Rape or assault? There's a price for that too. This approach creates an explicitly two-tiered justice system where the wealthy can essentially purchase the right to break laws that would result in physical punishment or death for the poor. Perhaps most alien to modern sensibilities is the concept of collective punishment. Your entire family or even village might suffer consequences for your individual actions. If you flee after committing a crime, your relatives might be imprisoned or have their property seized. Villages sometimes share collective responsibility for crimes committed within their boundaries, creating intense social pressure to conform to laws and turn in offenders. This system brutally sacrifices individual justice for social control. For women, the justice system presents additional hazards. Accusations of witchcraft, though not as common as popular media suggests, disproportionately target women, particularly those who are elderly, live alone, or possess knowledge of herbal medicine. The witch trials that would reach their peak in the early modern period have medieval precursors that demonstrate how easily social suspicion can transform into legal persecution when supernatural explanations for misfortune are widely accepted. The village falls unusually quiet as rumors spread that a traveler from the next town over has fallen ill with strange, swollen lumps in his neck. This seemingly innocuous gossip is actually the beginning of the most terrifying aspect of medieval life: epidemic disease. Your modern world of antibiotics, vaccines, and germ theory allows you to view most illnesses as inconveniences rather than death sentences. In medieval Europe, however, the appearance of certain symptoms could signal the beginning of a community-wide catastrophe from which many would not survive. The Black Death, bubonic plague, stands as the most infamous of medieval epidemics, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. The disease presents initially with flu-like symptoms before developing the characteristic buboes, painfully swollen lymph nodes in the neck, armpits, and groin that can grow as large as chicken eggs. Without understanding of bacteria or how the disease spreads, primarily via fleas carried by rats, medieval communities had no effective preventative measures or treatments. The mortality rate for bubonic plague in the medieval period approached 60 to 80% of those infected, and the more rare pneumonic form, spread directly person to person through the air, was nearly 100% fatal. Your chances of surviving any serious illness in medieval times are dramatically reduced by the medical practices we discussed earlier. Bloodletting, the go-to treatment for almost any serious condition, actually weakens patients who are already fighting infection. The belief that illness represents an imbalance of humors leads to treatments aimed at inducing vomiting, diarrhea, or sweating, all of which can cause dangerous dehydration in someone already battling disease. Even if you somehow manage to survive the illness itself, you might still succumb to the cures being administered. One particularly quirky medieval response to plague was the emergence of flagellant movements, groups of religious zealots who traveled from town to town publicly whipping themselves to appease God's wrath, which was widely believed to be the cause of the epidemic. These dramatic processions sometimes attracted hundreds of participants and large crowds of onlookers. Historians still argue whether these movements helped spread the very disease they were attempting to address by bringing large groups together during outbreaks. Beyond plague, Numerous other infectious diseases regularly swept through medieval populations. Smallpox, with its distinctive pustular rash, caused recurring epidemics with mortality rates of 20 to 30%. Survivors often bore permanent facial scarring and sometimes blindness. Leprosy, while not actually highly contagious, created such fear that those afflicted were completely ostracized from society, forced to wear distinctive clothing or ring bells to warn others of their approach, and often relegated to isolated leper colonies for the remainder of their lives. Tuberculosis, known variously as consumption, phthisis, or the White Plague, claimed countless lives with its wasting progression of coughing, fever, and eventual respiratory failure. The bacterial cause wouldn't be identified until the 19th century, leaving medieval sufferers with no effective treatments beyond rest and nutritional support, which were luxuries few working people could afford. The disease's slow progression, sometimes extending over years, created a particularly insidious drain on community resources and family caregivers. Children faced an especially harrowing gauntlet of infectious diseases. Measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, and scarlet fever regularly claimed the lives of the youngest community members. Without vaccination or antibiotics, these diseases, now rarely fatal in developed countries, contributed to the shocking child mortality rates of the medieval period. Approximately 30 to 50% of children died before reaching age 10, with most of these deaths occurring in the first year of life. This grim reality affected everything from emotional attachment to child-rearing practices and even naming conventions. Some families wouldn't formally name a child until it had survived its first year or longer. Intestinal parasites represented another constant health threat. Without modern sanitation or understanding of how these organisms spread, most people harbored multiple parasitic infections throughout their lives. Roundworms, hookworms, and tapeworms caused chronic malnutrition by literally stealing nutrients from the food you consumed. These parasites could grow to alarming sizes, tapeworms reaching lengths of 20 feet or more, and cause complications far beyond simple digestive discomfort, including potentially fatal intestinal blockages or perforations. Foodborne illnesses occurred with frightening regularity due to limited food preservation techniques and no concept of bacterial contamination. Ergotism, caused by a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, periodically poisoned entire communities, causing convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes gangrene of the extremities leading to loss of fingers, toes, or limbs. This condition, sometimes called St. Anthony's fire, for the burning sensation it caused, might explain some cases of supposed witchcraft or demonic possession. Perhaps most disorienting to modern sensibilities would be the medieval understanding of disease causation. Without germ theory, illness was attributed to miasmas, bad air, astrological influences, divine punishment, or deliberate poisoning by marginalized groups. Jews in particular were often scapegoated during plague outbreaks, leading to horrific pogroms and massacres based entirely on unfounded accusations. The inability to accurately identify the causes of disease led to preventative measures and treatments that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. Your modern expectation of disease as an identifiable, treatable condition with a predictable course would be completely upended in the medieval world. Instead, illness represented a frightening, often supernatural affliction with uncertain progression and treatment. The psychological burden of living with this constant uncertainty, knowing that a simple cough or fever might signal the beginning of a community-wide catastrophe that could claim half your family and neighbors, created a relationship with illness fundamentally different from our contemporary experience. When epidemics struck, social order often collapsed as those who could flee did so, unknowingly spreading disease further, while the poor remained trapped in increasingly desperate conditions. Fields went unharvested, trade ceased, and basic services disappeared as fear overwhelmed community cohesion. In the aftermath of major outbreaks, labor shortages actually improved conditions for surviving workers who could demand better compensation and treatment. One of the few silver linings to these demographic catastrophes, though hardly consolation for the massive suffering they caused. As you navigate the muddy village street, you instinctively step aside and lower your eyes as a nobleman's entourage approaches. This isn't just good manners. It's a legal necessity that could save you from a beating or worse. The social hierarchy of medieval times isn't just about wealth differences as in our modern world. It's a rigidly defined system with almost impermeable boundaries, elaborate rules of conduct, and consequences for forgetting your place that would seem brutally unjust by contemporary standards. Medieval society operates on the principle that hierarchy is divinely ordained, that God himself has established a great chain of being, with each person assigned their proper place. This belief system makes challenging the social order not just difficult but sacrilegious. Unlike modern capitalist societies where, theoretically at least, anyone can rise through hard work and talent, medieval social mobility is severely restricted by both formal laws and powerful social conventions. At the top of this pyramid sits the monarch, king or queen, believed to rule by divine right as God's chosen representative. Below them are the nobility, themselves arranged in complex hierarchies from powerful dukes and earls down to minor barons and knights. The clergy form a parallel power structure with their own internal rankings from archbishops down to parish priests and monks. Beneath these privileged groups are the townspeople, merchants, and craftsmen organized into guilds with their own internal hierarchies. At the bottom, making up 90% or more of the population, are the peasants who work the land, themselves divided between free tenants and serfs bound to their lords. One particularly quirky aspect of medieval social hierarchy is the elaborate system of sumptuary laws restricting what you can wear based on your social status. Certain colors, particularly purple, fabrics, like silk, and adornments such as fur trim or gold embroidery, are legally reserved for specific social ranks. These laws aren't just about maintaining visual distinctions between classes. They're designed to prevent the moral offense of people appearing to be something they're not. Historians still argue whether these laws were primarily motivated by moral concerns about appropriate display or economic protectionism for local industries against foreign luxury imports. Your speech patterns immediately identify your social position. The vocabulary you use, your accent, and even the languages you speak mark you as belonging to a particular rung on the social ladder. Nobles in England post-Norman conquest speak French among themselves while addressing peasants in English. Latin remains the language of the church and learned discourse. Being multilingual isn't just an impressive skill. It's a marker of privilege and education available only to certain classes. Physical gestures of deference permeate daily interactions between social classes. A peasant encountering a noble might be expected to remove their hat, bow deeply, avoid direct eye contact, and use specific honorifics when speaking. Failure to show proper deference isn't just rude. It can be interpreted as challenging the social order itself and punished accordingly. These symbolic demonstrations of hierarchy occur countless times daily, constantly reinforcing everyone's understanding of their relative social position. Dining practices reflect and reinforce social distinctions with almost theatrical precision. At a lord's feast, seating arrangements follow strict protocols based on rank, with the highest status guests seated closest to the host at the high table, often on a raised platform. Food service follows a prescribed order, with the finest dishes presented first to the highest-ranking diners. Even the types of food available differ dramatically by class: white bread for nobles, dark rye for peasants. Fresh meat for the privileged, salted or preserved meat, if any, for the lower orders. For peasants, especially serfs, the restrictions on personal freedom would be shocking to modern sensibilities. You might be legally bound to the land you work, unable to relocate without your lord's permission. You must obtain approval to marry, sometimes paying a fee for the privilege. You're required to work a certain number of days on your lord's lands in addition to tending your own plots. Some lords even maintain rights of first night, though historians debate how often this was actually exercised, claiming the right to sleep with new brides before their husbands. Women face additional hierarchical constraints across all social classes. A nobleman's daughter has more privilege than a male peasant in many respects but remains legally subordinate to the men of her family. Female inheritance is restricted, with property and titles typically passing through male lines. Women's occupations are limited, with many guilds refusing female members or restricting them to certain roles. Widowhood sometimes offers rare independence, as widows may inherit control of businesses or property, but this freedom remains constrained by broader social expectations and legal limitations. Religion reinforces the hierarchical worldview, with church teachings emphasizing that each person should accept their God-given station rather than aspiring to change it. The virtue of humility is particularly stressed for those of lower rank, while nobles are reminded of their obligations to those beneath them, a system of mutual though unequal obligations that provided the theoretical justification for the entire feudal system. Challenging these divinely sanctioned arrangements isn't just politically radical but potentially heretical. The psychological impact of living within such rigid hierarchies is profound. Your identity is largely defined by your place in the social order rather than your individual qualities or achievements. Ambition takes different forms than in our meritocratic ideal, seeking to excel within your prescribed role rather than transcending it. Accepting these limitations isn't just pragmatic but integrated into moral and religious worldviews that make the social hierarchy seem natural and right rather than arbitrary and oppressive. Perhaps most alien to modern democratic sensibilities would be the complete absence of any notion of equality before the law or inherent human rights. Justice explicitly differs by social rank, with nobles entitled to different courts, procedures, and punishments than commoners. The concept that all humans possess certain fundamental rights by virtue of their humanity alone would be not just foreign but potentially disturbing to the medieval mind, as it undermines the entire conceptual foundation of their social order. The few examples of successful mobility between classes only emphasize how exceptional such transitions were. A particularly talented craftsman might amass enough wealth to have his children educated for the clergy, or a brilliant scholar of humble origins might rise through church ranks. But these rare cases required extraordinary talent, favorable circumstances, and often powerful patrons willing to challenge convention by supporting someone rising above their station. For the vast majority, the social rank assigned at birth determined their opportunities, treatment, and destiny throughout life. The church bells ring out across the village, calling the faithful to prayer. This isn't a casual invitation. It's a mandatory summons that shapes the rhythm of your entire day, week, and life. In medieval Europe, religion isn't compartmentalized as an optional Sunday activity or personal choice as in our secular age. Instead, the church permeates every aspect of existence, serving simultaneously as spiritual authority, governmental power, educational institution, social welfare system, and cosmic explanation for everything from weather patterns to personal fortune. The medieval day is structured around religious observances that cannot be ignored without serious social and potentially legal consequences. Prayer punctuates the daily schedule, with bells signaling canonical hours. Matins before dawn, lauds at daybreak, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, that regulate activities for monastics and lay people alike. These aren't just prayer times for the devout. They serve as the functional clock for society, with commercial and agricultural activities scheduled around these standardized intervals. Your calendar revolves around religious feasts and fasts that number well over 100 days annually. Each saint's day brings its own traditions, prohibitions, and required observances. Forgetting these can result in more than just spiritual repercussions. Community censure and even legal penalties might await those who work on holy days or fail to observe mandatory fasts. The liturgical seasons, Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, create a continuous cycle of preparation, celebration, penitence, and renewal that gives shape and meaning to the passing year. One particularly quirky aspect of medieval religious practice is the elaborate system of food restrictions. Fasting doesn't just mean eating less but adhering to specific prohibitions. No meat on Fridays and numerous other days, no animal products whatsoever during Lent. These restrictions spawn creative culinary workarounds, including the classification of beavers and barnacle geese as fish because they live in water, making them permissible during fast days. Historians still argue whether these dietary rules were primarily motivated by spiritual discipline, economic considerations, or health concerns dressed in religious language. For the average medieval person, salvation isn't just your primary spiritual concern. It's your constant preoccupation, influencing countless daily decisions. The concept of purgatory, a state between heaven and hell where souls undergo purification through suffering, creates a complex economy of indulgences, prayers for the dead, and good works aimed at reducing time in this unpleasant spiritual waiting room. Without mathematical certainty about your spiritual standing, anxiety about the afterlife drives behaviors that might seem irrational from our secular perspective. Religious thought literally shapes how you perceive the physical world. Natural disasters aren't just meteorological or geological events, but divine judgments requiring spiritual interpretation and response. A crop failure might be attributed to insufficient piety in the community. Disease outbreaks could signal divine displeasure requiring processions, prayers, or increased charitable giving to appease an angry God. This worldview creates a universe where physical and spiritual causation are inseparably intertwined. The Church maintains a monopoly on literacy and learning that gives it enormous power over information access and interpretation. Scripture readings and sermons are delivered in Latin, a language incomprehensible to most lay people, making them dependent on clerical interpretation of religious texts. This creates a top-down system of knowledge transmission where questioning or independent interpretation is not just discouraged but potentially heretical. The few books available are primarily religious texts, hand-copied in monastic scriptoria at enormous expense of time and materials. For women, religious life offers a complex mixture of restrictions and rare opportunities. Convents provide one of the few socially acceptable alternatives to marriage, allowing some women to pursue education and spiritual development outside male-dominated household structures. Female mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, or Catherine of Siena achieve influence through direct divine revelation that bypasses, while carefully not directly challenging, male ecclesiastical authority. Nevertheless, women remain excluded from priesthood and formal church hierarchy, their spiritual expressions frequently subject to heightened scrutiny for potential heresy. Parish priests serve as community fixtures with power extending far beyond spiritual matters. Your local priest might be surprisingly integrated into village life, potentially married with children despite official celibacy requirements, clerical celibacy being inconsistently enforced before the Counter-Reformation, farming his own allotment and participating in local governance. He might be the only literate person in your village, making him essential for document creation, letter writing, and interpreting communications from distant authorities. The omnipresence of death in medieval life gives spiritual concerns particular urgency. With average life expectancy in the 30s, though those who survive childhood could often reach their 50s or 60s, preparation for death isn't something to postpone until old age. Deathbed confessions, extreme unction, last rites, and proper burial in consecrated ground take on enormous importance. The concept of dying suddenly without spiritual preparation, What medieval people called a bad death represents a terrifying prospect that might condemn your soul to eternal suffering. Perhaps most alien to modern sensibilities would be the complete interpenetration of religious and civic authority. Heresy isn't just a theological error but a crime against the social order itself, potentially punishable by death. Religious conformity is seen as essential to community welfare, making those who question established doctrine dangerous not just spiritually but socially and politically. The modern concept of religious tolerance or separation of church and state would be not merely foreign but potentially threatening to a society that viewed cosmic and social order as fundamentally inseparable. Pilgrimage represents one of the most distinctive religious practices of the medieval period, with people of all social classes undertaking arduous journeys to holy sites seeking cures, forgiveness, or spiritual merit. These journeys might be voluntary acts of devotion or imposed as penances for serious sins. The major pilgrimage routes to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem create international networks of hospices, churches, and economic exchange. For many medieval people, pilgrimage provides the only opportunity for travel beyond their immediate region, expanding their worldview even as it reinforces their religious identity. The pervasive presence of religious imagery in medieval life would be overwhelming to modern secular sensibilities. Churches dominate the physical landscape with spires visible for miles. Religious paintings, sculptures, and stained glass serve as the primary visual media of the age, their iconography instantly recognizable to even illiterate viewers. Your home likely contains religious objects, perhaps a crude crucifix, an image of the local patron saint, or blessed herbs hanging from rafters for protection. These aren't mere decorations but functional spiritual technology believed to offer tangible protection from both worldly and supernatural dangers. The village is abuzz with excitement. The Lord's youngest daughter is to be married next month, just after her 12th birthday. What strikes you as horrifying child exploitation would be considered a perfectly normal, even somewhat delayed marital arrangement in medieval times. Your modern concepts of romance, family planning, and age-appropriate relationships bear almost no resemblance to the medieval approach to marriage, which functions primarily as an economic and political institution rather than an emotional one. Marriage in medieval Europe is fundamentally a property arrangement, particularly among the nobility and merchant classes where significant assets are involved. Marriages are negotiated between families with the primary goal of securing advantageous alliances, consolidating land holdings, or merging business interests. The young couple's personal preferences are secondary considerations at best, completely irrelevant at worst. Your modern expectation of marrying for love would seem dangerously frivolous to medieval parents responsible for their family's economic survival and social advancement. The age at which people marry varies considerably by social class and gender. Among the nobility, marriages are often arranged in childhood, though consummation might be delayed until the bride reaches puberty, typically around 12 to 14 years old. For peasants and urban workers, marriage tends to occur later, with women usually in their late teens and men in their mid-20s. This delay allows working-class individuals to acquire the resources and skills necessary to establish independent households. The modern concept of adolescence as a protected developmental stage between childhood and adulthood simply doesn't exist. One particularly quirky aspect of medieval marriage is the distinction between betrothal and wedding, two separate ceremonies that might be separated by years. Betrothals are legally binding agreements between families that can be arranged when children are very young, while the actual wedding takes place closer to the age of consummation. Historians still argue whether these separated ceremonies developed primarily to accommodate political alliances that needed to be secured early or as a practical response to high childhood mortality rates, allowing families to formalize agreements while hedging against the possibility that betrothed children might not survive to marriageable age. The Church's growing authority over marriage during the medieval period creates interesting tensions between religious ideals and social practices. While Christian doctrine increasingly emphasizes mutual consent as essential for valid marriage, social and economic pressures make such consent often more theoretical than real, particularly for women. By the late medieval period, the church requires marriage to be contracted publicly at the church door rather than through private arrangements, an attempt to prevent secret marriages and ensure proper consent, though family pressure to accept arranged matches remains intense. Childbearing begins almost immediately after marriage for most women, with first pregnancies often occurring within a year of the wedding. Without effective contraception, a married woman might experience 15 to 20 pregnancies during her reproductive years, though high infant mortality means fewer children survive to adulthood. This constant cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and lactation takes an enormous physical toll, contributing significantly to women's shorter life expectancies compared to men. A demographic pattern opposite to modern trends. Childbirth itself represents one of the most dangerous experiences in a medieval woman's life. Without antiseptic conditions, cesarean sections, or treatments for common complications like eclampsia or hemorrhage, maternal mortality rates are staggering by modern standards. Approximately 1 to 2% of births result in the mother's death, meaning a woman who goes through multiple pregnancies faces a cumulative risk that would be utterly unacceptable in contemporary healthcare. Many children grow up having never known their birth mothers, raised instead by stepmothers after their fathers remarry, sometimes multiple times as subsequent wives also die in childbirth. Infant care practices would alarm modern parents and pediatricians alike. Newborns are tightly swaddled with their limbs bound straight to the body, sometimes for months, based on the belief that this prevents physical deformities and promotes straight growth. This practice severely restricts movement and physical development while making babies easier to manage when adults must return to work. Wet nursing is common across all social classes due to the belief that sexual activity taints breast milk, making a nursing mother's milk unsafe if she resumes relations with her husband. Among the nobility, sending infants away to wet nurses is standard practice, meaning some highborn children spend their first years rarely seeing their parents. Children are viewed as miniature adults rather than beings with unique developmental needs. By age 7, children are expected to contribute meaningfully to household labor or begin apprenticeships. Physical discipline is not just accepted but considered essential for proper moral development. The concept of sparing the rod and spoiling the child is taken quite literally. Children's games and activities often directly mimic adult responsibilities, serving as practical preparation for their future roles rather than protected spaces for creativity or self-expression. For men, marriage brings significant legal authority over their wives and households. Under the legal principle of coverture, a married woman's legal identity is subsumed into her husband's. She cannot own property independently, make contracts, or engage in business without his permission. Her body legally belongs to her husband, making the concept of marital rape non-existent. A husband's sexual access to his wife is considered an absolute right. Physical correction of wives is legally permitted and socially accepted within certain boundaries, though extreme cruelty might eventually prompt church or community intervention. Despite these harsh realities, medieval marriages aren't universally loveless arrangements. Historical records reveal couples who developed deep affection and partnership despite inauspicious beginnings. Letters between spouses sometimes display genuine tenderness and concern. With divorce effectively impossible for most people, couples have powerful incentives to make their relationships functional if not harmonious. The modern romantic ideal of marriage as primarily an emotional bond may be absent, but human connection nonetheless emerges within the constraints of medieval marriage's practical foundations. Perhaps most disorienting to modern sensibilities would be the complete integration of economic and romantic life. The household functions as both family dwelling and productive workplace, with husband and wife operating as business partners in agricultural or craft production. Marriage isn't about finding personal fulfillment but securing the economic cooperation necessary for survival. The qualities valued in a potential spouse: health, work capacity, household skills, family connections, reflect this pragmatic approach to an institution where affection is hoped for but prosperity is essential. The concept of privacy within marriage would be virtually non-existent by contemporary standards. Your marital bed likely occupies the main room of a single-room dwelling, possibly shared with children, other family members, or even livestock in poorer households. Intimacy occurs in full awareness if not direct view of others, with bed curtains providing the only separation in more prosperous homes. This lack of privacy extends to most aspects of married life, with community and family members feeling entitled to comment on and intervene in everything from fertility issues to spousal conflicts. As the sun rises, you watch the parish priest instruct a small group of boys in Latin grammar while village girls remain with their mothers, learning household tasks through observation and practice. The contrast highlights one of the most profound differences between medieval and modern life: the approach to education, knowledge, and intellectual development. Your modern assumption that everyone deserves basic literacy and access to information would seem not just unrealistic but potentially dangerous to medieval sensibilities. For the vast majority of medieval people, formal education simply isn't part of life experience. Literacy rates across medieval Europe hover between 5 to 10% of the population, with significant variations between regions and time periods. The ability to read and write exists primarily among clergy, nobles, and some merchants for whom these skills serve practical purposes. For peasants engaged in agricultural labor, literacy offers little obvious benefit while requiring time and resources few can spare. Your modern concept of education as a universal right and prerequisite for social participation would be completely foreign. The gender gap in education is stark and explicitly maintained. Boys from wealthier families might receive basic instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic from parish priests or at cathedral schools. Those destined for religious life enter monasteries where they study religious texts, Latin, and sometimes classical knowledge preserved from antiquity. Girls, with few exceptions, receive only domestic education, learning household management, textile production, food preservation, and childcare skills from mothers and female relatives. The handful of women who do become literate typically receive education in convents or, very rarely, from private tutors in noble households. One particularly quirky aspect of medieval education is the practice of sending children as young as 7 away from home to begin their training for adult roles. Noble boys might become pages in other aristocratic households, learning courtly behavior and martial skills while serving as attendants. Apprenticeships for craft trades similarly remove children from their families, placing them in master craftsmen's households where they work as much as they learn. Historians still argue whether this practice developed primarily for educational effectiveness or as a way for families to reduce the number of dependents they needed to support directly. The content of medieval education bears little resemblance to modern curricula. The trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric forms the foundation of formal learning, followed by the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, for those pursuing advanced studies. All of these subjects are approached through religious frameworks, with scripture and church fathers' writings serving as primary texts. The purpose isn't to develop critical thinking or independent inquiry, but to accurately preserve and transmit established knowledge within orthodox interpretations. For the small minority who progress to university education, exclusively male and predominantly preparing for religious or legal careers, the learning environment would seem shockingly different from modern higher education. Students begin university studies around age 14, living in collegiate housing under strict discipline. Teaching occurs through lectures where authorities are read aloud, necessary when books are rare and expensive, and disputations, formal debates conducted according to strict logical rules. Creative thinking is discouraged in favor of mastering existing authorities and reconciling apparent contradictions within established frameworks. Books, those fundamental tools of learning in any era, exist in quantities and forms that would be unrecognizable to modern readers. Each volume represents months or years of labor, with animal skins processed into parchment, prepared for writing, meticulously copied by hand, and often elaborately decorated. A single book might cost as much as a house, making personal ownership impossible for all but the wealthiest individuals and institutions. Monastic libraries containing a few hundred volumes represent major intellectual treasures. Your modern expectation of unlimited access to information would seem like an impossible fantasy. Superstition and empirical knowledge coexist in ways that would confuse your modern sensibilities. A midwife might effectively use herbal remedies whose medicinal properties would eventually be scientifically validated, while simultaneously employing magical charms and astrological timing she considers equally essential to the treatment's success. The boundary between natural and supernatural causation remains indistinct, with divine or demonic intervention considered routine explanations for phenomena now understood through scientific principles. The transmission of practical knowledge occurs almost entirely through direct apprenticeship rather than written instruction. Agricultural techniques, craft production methods, and household skills pass from experienced practitioners to novices through observation, imitation, and supervised practice. This system preserves effective methods but also perpetuates inefficiencies and errors, as innovation occurs primarily through accident or necessity rather than systematic experimentation or theoretical improvement. The modern concept of technological progress as a continuous, intentional process would be largely incomprehensible. Perhaps most alien to modern sensibilities would be the medieval approach to intellectual authority and truth. Knowledge isn't something to be questioned and expanded, but rather a fixed treasure to be preserved and accurately transmitted. Innovation and original thinking aren't praised but treated with suspicion. When new ideas emerge, they gain acceptance by presenting themselves as rediscoveries of ancient wisdom rather than novel concepts. The modern value placed on creativity and challenging established thinking would seem not just strange but potentially dangerous and destabilizing. Religious and secular knowledge aren't separate domains but completely integrated perspectives. Natural philosophy, what we would now call science, operates within theological frameworks, with physical phenomena understood as manifestations of divine principles. Astronomy serves both to track celestial movements and to interpret their astrological significance. Medicine considers both physical causes and spiritual conditions affecting health. This holistic approach prevents the specialized, compartmentalized knowledge typical of modern disciplines, instead seeking unified explanations that encompass all aspects of existence. For women, intellectual development faces particularly severe constraints. Even noble women who achieve literacy typically have restricted access to texts deemed appropriate for female readers, primarily religious works, perhaps some romances or household management guides. Female intellectual accomplishments are frequently viewed with suspicion, as excessive learning in women is associated with moral danger and potential challenges to proper authority. The few women who achieve significant intellectual recognition, like Hildegard of Bingen or Christine de Pizan, must carefully frame their contributions within acceptable religious frameworks and often emphasize divine inspiration rather than personal intellectual achievement. The concept of childhood as a time primarily dedicated to education and development simply doesn't exist for most medieval people. Learning occurs alongside productive labor from an early age, with children's economic contributions considered essential to household survival rather than exploitation. By modern standards, medieval childhood appears brutally short and instrumentalized, with most children engaging in adult work patterns by their early teens if not before. Your contemporary understanding of childhood as a protected period for personal growth, play, and education would seem like an unaffordable luxury in a world where survival demands all available hands contribute to production. The village buzzes with excitement. A merchant caravan has been spotted approaching from the east, a rare connection to the wider world beyond your isolated community. This momentary thrill of anticipation highlights one of the most profound differences between medieval and modern existence: the experience of travel and mobility. Your casual expectation of hopping in a car for a weekend getaway or booking a flight to another continent would seem like pure sorcery to your medieval counterpart. Distance in medieval Europe isn't measured in miles or kilometers but in days of travel. A journey of 20 miles, something you might casually commute in half an hour, represents a full day's travel on foot, the primary mode of transportation for most people. The world effectively shrinks to the distance one can reasonably walk, making the next town over seem distant and major cities almost mythically remote. Many peasants live their entire lives without venturing more than 10 miles from their birthplace, their mental map of the world constructed entirely from second-hand accounts of travelers and merchants. Roads, those basic infrastructure elements you take for granted, exist in conditions that would horrify modern transportation engineers. Roman roads, where they remain serviceable, provide relatively direct routes between major settlements, but most paths have developed organically through repeated use rather than intentional construction. Unpaved, unmarked, and unmaintained, these routes turn to nearly impassable mud during rainy seasons and become haunt of bandits in more isolated stretches. Without standardized maps or signage, wrong turns add days to journeys or lead travelers into dangerous terrain. One particularly quirky aspect of medieval travel is the complete absence of scheduled transportation. The concept of departures and arrivals at fixed times, the backbone of modern transportation systems, simply doesn't exist. Merchant caravans, the closest thing to public transportation, depart when they've assembled sufficient goods and travelers, and arrive when conditions permit. Historians still argue whether the modern preoccupation with punctuality developed primarily from Industrial Revolution work requirements or earlier from monastery schedules and urban markets, but medieval travelers certainly lacked our rigid expectations regarding journey times. The dangers of travel extend far beyond mere inconvenience. Bandits view travelers as legitimate prey, particularly those appearing prosperous. Wild animals, wolves, bears, and boars, still inhabit European forests in numbers sufficient to pose genuine threats. River crossings become deadly hazards during high water, while mountain passes claim lives through exposure, falls, or avalanches. These ever-present risks explain why medieval travelers commonly make wills before departing on significant journeys, and why travel companions often form legal agreements for mutual protection and proper burial should deaths occur en route. For those who can afford them, horses provide faster transportation but at substantial cost. A good riding horse might cost half a year's wages for an average worker, with maintenance expenses creating ongoing financial burden. Most people who use horses for travel are nobles, merchants, or officials whose position or profession demands mobility. Even with horseback travel, speeds rarely exceed 20 to 30 miles per day on good roads in favorable conditions. Your casual expectation of covering hundreds of miles in a single day would seem like supernatural power. Accommodations along travel routes bear no resemblance to modern hotels with their expectations of privacy, cleanliness, and standardized service. Monasteries provide lodging for pilgrims and travelers as part of their charitable mission, though accommodations vary dramatically from wealthy establishments offering reasonable comfort to impoverished houses providing little more than floor space. Commercial inns serve primarily as drinking establishments that also offer overnight accommodation, typically in communal rooms where travelers share beds with strangers. Bedbugs, lice, and fleas come as standard amenities, while security for persons and possessions depends largely on travelers' own vigilance. Navigation presents challenges that would frustrate even the most directionally gifted modern travelers. Without standardized maps, GPS, or even consistent signage, finding your way relies on local knowledge, oral directions, and landmarks that assume familiarity with regional geography. Rivers, distinctive hills, church spires, and ancient trees serve as critical waypoints. Wrong turns don't just add time but potentially lead into dangerous terrain or hostile territories. Your modern anxiety about your phone's battery dying and losing map access pales compared to the medieval traveler's fundamental uncertainty about routes and destinations. Weather transforms from mere inconvenience to potential life-threatening obstacle. Rain turns unpaved roads to impassable mud that can strand travelers for days or weeks. Winter snow blocks mountain passes from autumn until late spring. Floods wash away bridges and fords without warning. With no weather forecasting beyond general seasonal expectations and folk wisdom about cloud patterns, travelers must accept these risks and build substantial time buffers into journey expectations. The modern concept of guaranteed arrival times would seem laughably optimistic. Class distinctions manifest dramatically in travel experiences. A nobleman travels with entourage and baggage train, commanding the best accommodations available and receiving preferential treatment at river crossings and town gates. Merchants travel in protected caravans with hired guards, balancing the substantial costs against cargo value. Pilgrims benefit from specialized infrastructure of hospices and designated routes, though comfort levels remain basic. Common travelers face every hardship with minimal resources, often joining groups for mutual protection despite the slower pace this necessitates. Perhaps most alien to modern sensibilities would be the medieval concept of travel purpose. The idea of recreational travel, journeying simply for pleasure or personal enrichment, barely exists outside rare accounts of the extremely wealthy. Valid travel reasons include trade, religious pilgrimage, official business, or family emergency. The modern concept of tourism would seem not just frivolous but incomprehensible, possibly even suspicious to medieval authorities accustomed to people remaining in their assigned places unless compelling reason dictated otherwise. Water travel offers faster movement but introduces its own terrors. Rivers provide natural highways for goods and people, but currents, rapids, and seasonal fluctuations create constant hazards. Coastal shipping connects port cities more efficiently than land routes, but navigation relies on shoreline visibility, making open water crossings perilous with period technology. Storms drive ships onto rocky coasts with terrifying regularity, while pirates view merchant vessels as legitimate targets. Even in good conditions, seasickness turns journeys into miserable experiences without effective remedies beyond folk treatments of questionable efficacy. The administrative complexity of medieval travel would frustrate even the most patient modern tourist. Political fragmentation means crossing multiple jurisdictions on journeys that would be contained within a single modern country. Each territory might require different permissions, toll payments, or documentation. Town gates close at sunset, forcing travelers to time arrivals carefully or face exclusion until morning. Some regions restrict travel for certain groups entirely or impose special taxes based on religion, occupation, or origin. Your expectation of frictionless movement across political boundaries would seem naively optimistic if not completely unrealistic. As evening falls, villagers gather around the central bonfire for a rare night of communal entertainment. The traveling minstrel who arrived with the merchant caravan will perform ballads and tales from distant lands, a treasured diversion from daily toil. This gathering highlights the final medieval reality that would shock your modern sensibilities: the nature of entertainment and leisure. Your Netflix subscription, video games, and endless social media scroll would be replaced by diversions simultaneously more communal and often more brutal than anything in your modern experience. For the average medieval person, entertainment isn't separated from daily life but woven into the fabric of work and community. Singing while working in the fields, storytelling during evening textile production, and casual contests of strength or skill during breaks serve as integrated diversions rather than designated leisure activities. The modern concept of entertainment time, as distinct from productive hours, would seem strange in a world where survival demands near constant labor and daylight dictates activity patterns. Religious festivals provide the primary structured entertainment in the medieval calendar, with church holidays offering rare official breaks from work. These celebrations blend religious observance with communal feasting, dancing, games, and performances that serve as emotional release valves in an otherwise grueling existence. The Feast of Fools allows brief social inversion, with commoners mockingly impersonating nobility and clergy. May Day celebrations with maypole dancing, mummers' plays, and selection of a May Queen bring communities together while celebrating seasonal renewal. These festivities constitute the closest equivalent to your weekend plans, though occurring far less frequently. One particularly quirky aspect of medieval entertainment is the elaborate system of animal sports, many of which would horrify modern animal welfare sensibilities. Bear baiting and bull baiting, where chained animals fight trained dogs while spectators place bets on the outcome, draw enthusiastic crowds from all social classes. Cockfighting serves as a more accessible blood sport for those who can't afford to maintain larger animals. Historians still argue whether these activities primarily reflected cultural insensitivity to animal suffering or served as psychological outlets for communities facing harsh conditions and limited control over their own circumstances. Tournaments represent the pinnacle of aristocratic entertainment, combining martial displays with social networking opportunities. Far from the romanticized jousting matches of modern Renaissance fairs, early medieval tournaments often resembled actual battle conditions, with groups of knights engaging in dangerous melees across large areas of countryside. By the late medieval period, these events evolve into more structured spectacles with individual jousting, but remain legitimately dangerous. Knights regularly suffer serious injuries and occasional fatalities, even in supposedly friendly competition. Music permeates medieval life but bears little resemblance to modern recorded and reproduced sound. For peasants, music means unaccompanied singing during work, simple instruments like pipes or drums played by community members, or perhaps traveling musicians at special occasions. Musical literacy remains rare, with tunes transmitted orally and varying significantly between regions. Without recording technology, each performance remains unique and ephemeral. Your modern expectation of perfect reproducibility and unlimited access to professional quality music would seem like supernatural luxury. Storytelling serves as both entertainment and information transmission in a largely illiterate society. Professional storytellers, minstrels, jongleur, and bards travel between communities, bringing news, legends, and epic tales memorized through formulaic structures and mnemonic techniques. These performers don't just recite but actively adapt stories to audience preferences, local contexts, and current events. The boundary between news reporting, entertainment, and propaganda remains fluid, with stories serving multiple social functions simultaneously. Games provide structured diversion across social classes, though with significant variations in access and equipment. Chess, backgammon, and tables, similar to modern backgammon, are popular among the educated elite who can afford expensive game pieces and have leisure to learn complex rules. Dice games, requiring minimal equipment and simple to understand, cross social boundaries and often involve gambling despite periodic church prohibitions. Physical games like hammer throwing, wrestling, and various ball games precursors to modern football/soccer, provide active entertainment while developing skills potentially useful in daily work or military service. Alcohol plays a central role in medieval entertainment that would alarm modern substance abuse counselors. Beer, ale, wine, and mead serve as both daily beverages, safer than often contaminated water, and social lubricants. Taverns function as community gathering places where stories are exchanged, games played, and business conducted amid significant consumption. Festivals typically involve substantial collective intoxication, with even church authorities generally accepting periodic excess as part of communal celebration. Your modern concept of moderate, responsible drinking would seem unnecessarily restrictive in contexts where intoxication represents one of few available escapes from difficult realities. Children's play exists but serves different purposes than in modern child development frameworks. Games like hoop rolling, knucklebones, similar to jacks, or tag provide physical activity and social interaction but often directly mimic adult work or combat skills. Miniature weapons, farming implements, and household tools serve as toys that simultaneously prepare children for adult roles. The modern concept of childhood as a protected period primarily for play and development would seem impractically indulgent in a world where survival demands early contribution to household labor. Perhaps most alien to modern sensibilities would be medieval attitudes toward violence as entertainment. Public executions draw crowds as large as any festival, combining judicial function with spectacle. Hanging, beheading, and even burning or drawing and quartering serve as community events where families bring children to witness justice and enjoy the surrounding carnival atmosphere of vendors, performers, and social gathering. This integration of extreme violence into entertainment reflects fundamentally different sensibilities regarding death, justice, and community participation in punishment. For those rare individuals with access to books, reading remains a radically different experience from modern consumption of texts. Reading occurs primarily aloud, even when alone, and proceeds at a deliberately measured pace, allowing for memorization and contemplation rather than rapid information gathering. A single book might be revisited throughout a lifetime, yielding new insights with each reading rather than being consumed and discarded. The modern habit of rapidly consuming multiple texts would seem disrespectfully superficial to medieval readers who view books as precious repositories of wisdom deserving careful, even reverential attention. The absence of privacy in medieval living arrangements transforms entertainment into inherently communal experience. With multiple generations sharing living spaces, individual pursuits remain visible to all household members. Entertainment choices require at least tacit group approval, creating social regulation of leisure activities. Your modern ability to privately consume content that might shock or offend others in your household would be practically impossible in medieval living conditions where all activities remain visible to family and neighbors. The evening's entertainment draws to a close as the minstrel finishes his final tale. Villagers reluctantly drift back to their homes, knowing tomorrow brings another day of endless toil. As you settle onto your uncomfortable straw mattress, the contrast between medieval life and your modern existence has never seemed more stark. The brutal physical realities, omnipresent dangers, rigid social restrictions, and limited opportunities would make even a single day exhausting by modern standards. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep, you finally understand why historians view the technological, medical, and social developments of recent centuries not just as changes but as fundamental transformations in the human experience. Perhaps the most profound difference lies not in specific hardships but in expectations themselves. Medieval people didn't view their conditions as primitive or unnecessarily difficult. It was simply life as they understood it to be, with hardship as the expected norm rather than a problem to be solved. This acceptance of limitation and suffering as natural human conditions represents perhaps the greatest psychological gulf between their worldview and your modern expectation of comfort, choice, and constant improvement. As sleep finally claims you, you find yourself profoundly grateful to be returning to your modern reality, with all its complexities and problems but also its remarkable comforts and possibilities unimaginable to your medieval counterparts. As the final strands of consciousness slip away, the sharp edges of medieval hardship begin to soften in your mind. The weight of those distant struggles gradually lifts, replaced by a gentle awareness of your own comfortable present. The scratchy straw mattress fades into the plush support of your modern bed. The persistent medieval chill dissolves as your contemporary room maintains its perfect sleeping temperature. The sounds change too. No longer the rustling of animals in the thatch overhead or the coughing of family members sharing your cramped quarters, but perhaps the gentle white noise of a fan or the distant urban hum that forms the backdrop to your modern sleep. Your breathing slows and deepens as you drift further from those medieval struggles and deeper into restful sleep. Even as the specific details of medieval hardships begin to blur in your drowsing mind, you carry forward a profound appreciation for the countless generations whose persistent efforts gradually transformed human existence. Their struggles, innovations, and incremental improvements across centuries created the foundation for the comforts you now take for granted. The contrast between their daily challenges and your modern conveniences serves not just as historical perspective but as a gentle reminder of how fortunate you are to live in this particular moment of human history. As you float in that liminal space between consciousness and dreams, perhaps there's also comfort in recognizing the common humanity that connects you across the centuries. Despite vastly different circumstances, medieval people shared the same fundamental hopes, fears, and capacity for joy that you experience. They loved their children, found moments of beauty amid hardship, and created communities that sustained them through difficulties you can barely imagine. Sweet dreams now. May your sleep be deep and refreshing, unmarked by the countless discomforts that would have interrupted medieval slumber. Rest easy in your modern bed, free from the vermin, smoke, and crowding that once made sleep itself a challenging endeavor. The medieval world has served its purpose, helping you drift away with newfound gratitude for your present reality and the countless human efforts that made it possible.